my perspective on memetics derives from cognitive psychology, as opposed to biology or anthropology, for example. And my talk today will be about a particular error that I think critics of the meme concept are making. The error is related to what has been termed the Great Rationality Debate in cognitive science. And this is a debate in which my colleague Richard West, down the end there, and I and Maggie have been involved in for over a decade. Before getting to the heart of this criticism and my rebuttal of it, a few preliminaries are in order regarding my position on the meme concept. It's well known that the meme concept has been the subject of enormous criticism, but I think that most of this criticism has been misguided. A large number of the criticisms of the meme concept result from the incorrect assumption that every concept in genetics must find a direct analogy in memetic science. For example, there has been considerable discussion in the literature about what the phenotype is in memetic studies, but this is misguided, because there will be no analogy to this genetic concept in memetics. This is because the meme is a naked replicator. It does not help to build a vehicle as does a gene. Instead, it is a replicator that is also an interactor. More generally, the point is that meme-gene disanalogies do not undermine the idea of the meme as a cultural replicator. In an incisive chapter in Robert Onger's edited volume, Hull argues that the science of memetics does not rely on a gene analogy, but instead on the selection principles of universal Darwinism at their most general level. Quote, memetics does not involve analogical reasoning at all. Instead, a general account of selection is being developed that applies equally to a variety of different sorts of differential replication, unquote. That we use the gene as a benchmark is only because we are biased toward privileging it because it appeared on the scene first. To be a true replicator, an entity need not recapitulate in detail each of the particular properties of the gene. In short, an entire set of criticisms vanishes if specific gene concept, meme concept disanalogies are not counted against memetics. Likewise, other often repeated criticisms have been the subject of strong rebuttals. For example, the issue of low copying fidelity and reconstructive versus copying approaches have received particular attention. I feel that most of these criticisms have already been adequately rebutted and agree with Lalonde and Brown that, quote, much of the criticism of memetics has concentrated on apparent problems that on closer examination seem to disappear. Here are some examples of disappearing criticisms that Lalonde and Brown discuss. You can't find the boundaries of a meme. In their response, they note that memetic units only appear hazy in comparison with simplistic concepts of genes and species. In fact, the biological world is a lot messier than commonly conceived. If uncertainty about the boundaries of a gene or species has not prevented progress in evolutionary biology, why should the fuzzy units of memetics be regarded as problematic? I am excerpting from a more detailed reply, of course, but I simply use these brief quotes to illustrate that Lalonde and Brown agree with Hull that the criticisms directed at memetics often involve inappropriate extrapolations from biological evolution. Another that they discuss, memes merged together. Part of their detailed reply, quote, in fact, this is another instance where an overly simple model of biological evolution is employed as a standard against which to dismiss a complicated memetics. Biological lineages have repeatedly come together over evolutionary time. A very common one that you hear a lot in the literature. Memetic evolution is Lamarckian and directed. Here, the critics are making a fundamental mistake by not trying hard enough to adopt a meme's-eye perspective, which of course is the whole point of creating memetics, to stress this alternative perspective. A meme is a naked replicator. It is a replicator that is also an interactor in its environment of selection, which is the human brain. As a naked replicator, memetic evolution will, of course, be Lamarckian. But, in contrast to biological theory, in memetic evolution, this is no criticism. As Lalonde and Brown note, the charge of directed Lamarckian evolution is correct but it does not invalidate cultural evolution any more than the direction and intention imposed by population geneticists that selected lines of Drosophila, or the animal breeders that favored high milk yields in cows, invalidates describing the results of artificial selection as evolutionary. The fact that mutations at the cultural level are sometimes not random, but smart variants informed by information acquired through evolutionary and non-evolutionary processes at other levels is not a weakness of memetics. And finally, one that Dan Sperber has made an incredibly common criticism of memetics. Cultural transmission is not transmitted from individual to individual, but is reconstructed by each individual inside their heads, perhaps exploiting evolved psychological mechanisms. This one has had incredible influence in the literature. But as several authors have pointed out, it is wrong-headed to view this point as a criticism of memetics. Genes as vectors of information likewise depend, once they arrive at a building site for constructing a body, on the existence of an environment containing the appropriate building blocks which the genes do not themselves carry. As Lalonde and Brown note, memeticists seemingly have grounds to predict the existence of reconstruction. To the extent that meme messages contain information that is likely to be accurately reconstructed by receiving brains anyway, then they contain redundancy. However, natural selection eliminates redundancy, as organisms that do not waste energy and resources will generally outcompete those who do. Thus, we might anticipate that memes only transmit that which is absolutely necessary and leave the rest for the receiving mind to reconstruct. Provided reconstruction is socially contingent, that is, provided that the expression of a meme by one individual provides the trigger for a second individual to acquire the same meme, as Sperber suggests, then reconstructed memes are just as subject to cultural evolution as transmitted memes. If Sperber's criticism is correct, it is actually good news for memetics, since if we are predisposed to reconstruct particular memes, it will mean there is another reason to expect meme fidelity to be high, unquote. Lalonde and Brown's rebuttals echo to all of these, and there are more in their book. They echo Hull, that complaints about the lack of conceptual clarity in memetics arise in part because of an unreal view of how clear and uncomplicated certain terms in science actually were or are. In general, critics of memetics assume standards so high for scientific knowledge that few, if any, areas of science can possibly meet them. Another reason that I find the criticisms of the meme concept to be unconvincing is that many of the criticisms paint the meme concept as a straw man. Before I give an example of this, I will briefly mention the stipulations on memetic concepts that I work from. My definition of the meme is heavily influenced by Unger's discussion. I prefer to view a meme as a brain control or informational state that can potentially cause fundamentally new behaviors and/or thoughts when replicated in another brain. Meme replication has taken place when control states that are causally similar to the source are replicated in the brain host of the copy. A meme is both a replicator and an interactor. Here, Hull's term interactor is more appropriate because memes do not build vehicles, as do genes. Because its environment of selection is the human brain, a meme is a naked replicator. Memes use brains as hosts and as mechanisms for sending signals which start replication reactions in other brains. Templates for future meme signals are stored in books, computers, and other media. Whenever possible, I like to adopt a less strong characterization of the meme concept. For example, I do not adopt Blackmore's idea that true imitation is the defining feature of memetic replication. True imitation is probably a sufficient feature for the conclusion that meme replication has taken place, but it is not a necessary feature. Likewise, I prefer to emphasize the minimal foundational claim that, for me, as a psychologist, fuels interest in memetics. The claim is something I call the fundamental insight triggered by memetic studies, and it is that a belief may spread without necessarily being true or helping the human being who holds the belief in any way. So the chain letter example often used in memetic writings. if you do not pass this message on to 5 people, you will experience misfortune, fits this bill quite well. First, it is not true. The reader who does not pass on the message will not experience misfortune. Second, the person who stores the meme and passes it on will receive no benefit. Yet the meme survives. It survives because of its own self-replicating properties. As a psychologist, again, keep in mind the perspective for this whole talk, I have found the memetic theory has a great perspective expanding role because it inverts the way that psychologists think about beliefs. Personality and social psychologists are traditionally apt to ask what it is about particular individuals that leads them to have certain beliefs. The causal model is one where the person determines the beliefs to have. Memetic theory asks instead, what is it about certain memes that leads them to collect many hosts for themselves? The question is not how do people acquire beliefs, the tradition in social and cognitive psychology, but how do beliefs acquire people? Likewise, our common sense view or folk psychology of why beliefs spread encompasses folk notions of belief X spreads because it is true, or X is esteemed because it is beautiful or good, but in turn has trouble accounting for ideas that are beautiful or true but not popular, and ideas that are popular but are neither beautiful nor true. Memetic theory tells us to look to a third principle in such cases. Idea X spreads among people because it has properties that make it a good replicator. It is good at acquiring hosts. This is the single distinctive function served by the meme concept in psychology, and I believe it is a critical one for my discipline. With this central insight from the memetic theory in mind, we can now list several classes of reason why beliefs survive and spread. The first 3 classes are reflected in traditional assumptions in the behavioral and biological sciences. The last reflects the new perspective of memetic theory. 1. Memes survive and spread because they are helpful to the people who store them. Most memes that reflect true information about the world would be in this category. 2. Certain memes are numerous because they are good fits to pre-existing genetic predispositions or domain-specific evolutionary modules. 3. Certain memes spread because they facilitate the replication of the genes that make vehicles that are good hosts for these particular memes. Religious beliefs that urge people to have more children would be in this category. And 4, memes survive and spread because of the self-perpetuating properties of the memes themselves. Categories 1, 2, and 3 are relatively uncontroversial. The first is standard fare in many social sciences. Category 2 is emphasized by the evolutionary psychologists. And Category 3 is meant to capture the type of effects covered by Susan Blackmore's concept of memetic drive and by the gene culture coevolution theorists. It is Category 4 that introduces new ways of thinking about beliefs as symbolic instructions that are more or less good at colonizing brains. Of course, it is recognized that a meme may reside in more than one category. A meme might spread because it aids the vehicle, and because it fits genetic predispositions, and because of its self-perpetuating properties. However, as Dennett has argued, mismatching replicator vehicle interests create conditions of particular theoretical interests. Likewise, Blackmore admits that in her 1999 book, she chose to emphasize disadvantageous and dangerous memes out of proportion because they highlight the contrast between the perspective of memetic theory and that of sociobiology and the gene culture coevolution theorists. There are many subcategories of meme survival strategies under the general category number 4, including proselytizing strategies, perseveration strategies, persuasive strategies, adversative strategies, freeloading strategies, and mimicking strategies. These have all been discussed in the literature. Memes can acquire protection against proselytizing by developing preservative strategies. For example, the use of the admonition, never argue about politics or religion, is a fairly transparent attempt by current memes in those categories to inoculate the host against proselytizing strategies by memes that might attempt to replace those currently resident. Some of the self-preservative strategies of memes are adversative. For example, strategies that alter the cultural environment in ways that make it more hostile to competing memes, or that influence their hosts to attack the hosts of competing memes. The fear engendered by the reaction to the Danish cartoon incident would be an example. Additionally, in category 4 are symbionts, memes that are more potent replicators when they appear together, and memes that appear to be advantageous to the vehicle but are not. The freeloaders and parasites that mimic the structure of helpful memes and deceive the host into thinking that the host will derive benefit from them. It is important to note that the term meme, for some scholars, carries with it connotations that are much stronger than my use of the term here. For example, Sperber uses the term meme not as a synonym for a cultural replicator, as I do, but as a cultural replicator, quote, standing to be selected not because they benefit their human carriers, but because they benefit themselves, unquote. That is, he reserves the term for category 4 listed in the slide. In contrast, my use of the term is more generic, as a synonym for cultural replicator, and it encompasses all 4 of the categories listed. Because most memes probably fall into more than one of the 4 categories, Sperber's definition has the effect of making the meme somewhat of a straw man, or much the same thing, something pretty statistically improbable. Sperber's definition leads us to ignore the self-perpetuating properties of helpful memes, and thus to ignore the fundamental insight of memetics. The reason is that even memes in categories 1 through 3 might contain properties of categories 4 as well. For example, the free speech memeplex is most likely helpful to individuals and societies, thus falling in category number 1, but appears to have some properties of category number 4 as well. A neutral outside observer, one without the free speech meme already installed, might wonder, for instance, whether the advocacy of the proposition that people should be killed because of their race has not already failed every empirical, logical, moral, and reasoning test. The neutral observer not already inoculated by the free speech meme might well ask what purpose is served in keeping this idea alive by guaranteeing it a hearing. The answer to this neutral critic that is contained within the free speech memeplex is that not to guarantee any idea a hearing would start us on a slippery slope to ban speech. However, this argument amounts to little more than the free speech memeplex warding off any attempt to evaluate whether it is serving the ends of the people or societies in which it resides. The argument here is not that the free speech meme is a pure parasite, only that it has certain evaluation disabling properties. Undoubtedly, this meme has provided vast benefits for the individuals and societies holding it, and thus belongs to category 1 as well as category 4. Sperber's overly strict definition directs attention away from its evaluation disabling properties by denying that it is a meme because, on his definition, it is not exclusively in category 4. I would argue that Sperber's definition is itself an evaluation biasing strategy, an example of my very point, and I reject it in favor of a more generic definition. Even Lalonde and Brown, in a book that I like very much, adopt an overly restrictive view of the memetic insight. For instance, in discussing different perspectives on culture, they state that evolutionary psychology would seem to have greater conflict with memetics, which denies any substantive filtering role for evolved psychological mechanisms. This is getting it backward and putting the burden of proof in the wrong place. The memetic insight does not deny a role for evoked culture, category 2 in my previous slide. Instead, it is evolutionary psychology which denies or drastically plays down the role of transmitted culture, as Lalonde and Brown later note. Quote, evolutionary psychology's focus on genetically evolved pan-human cognitive algorithms tends to make its practitioners relatively hostile to the view that humans acquire a substantial proportion of their beliefs and preferences through cultural inheritance, and that these can change through cultural evolution. So the fundamental memetic insight is obscured by 2 things I have discussed so far. 1, the tendency to require overly literal gene-meme conceptual analogies, and 2, the tendency to adopt overly strict definitions of a meme, particularly believe the requirement that it contain exclusively self-propagating properties. To these two, I would like to add a third obscuring strategy, one which I term the grain size error. I will illustrate it by examining a segment of a review of my book by Herb Gintis. Gintis loved my book, except for the chapter on memes. His point against me started out with great subtlety. Seriously, though, the basis of his real argument was revealing. He argued that the correct treatment of culture is that it is an epigenetic form of information transfer, and humans evolved to use it to enhance their fitness. The fact that sometimes we adopt harmful memes no more contradicts this than the fact that there are deleterious genetic mutation refutes Darwinism. So Gintis acknowledges the memetic insight, but somehow views memetics as denying that culture is at least partly an adaptation. This suggests that Gintis is holding a Sperber-like view of memetics, that it somehow denies the role of evoked culture or gene-culture coevolution. And of course, given his extensive writings on the subject, Gintis' brief is for the latter. Importantly, however, note that he is arguing with me about a large unit, culture. But I never took the arguments about memetics to be taking place at such a huge grain size. It is not critical for memetics, or perhaps I should say, for psychologists who use memetics to understand human rationality and irrationality, what the origins of culture are. The units that memetics deals with, at least for a psychologist, are more micro than that. What is going on here is that Gintis is focused on the capacity for culture and its evolved versus non-evolved nature, whereas I, like many other psychologists, am focused on the properties of the content of the cultural mechanisms, properties such as whether the content fosters or inhibits rational choices, for example. Lalonde and Brown make a similar point when they note that, quote, using our evolved capacity for social learning, we could theoretically acquire maladaptive information, unquote. Likewise, Norenzian urges us to distinguish the debate about the evolved psychological capacities that power cultural transmission from the cultural elements that the evolved psychological capacities deal with. These are two different things. The controversies surrounding the meme concept concern the latter, not the psychological capacities themselves. The debate is not about the mechanisms behind the human cultural system, e.g. social learning, etc., but whether the system can come to embed truly irrational beliefs, beliefs not serving either replicator or vehicle goals. But a capacity versus content confusion is not the only way that the existence of non-functional memes is obscured. A grain size error also occurs when investigators focus on content that is too broad and complex. For example, Dawkins and Blackmore have famously claimed that most religions are essentially copy-me memeplexes, quote, backed up with threats, promises, and ways of preventing their claims from being tested, unquote. Their arguments have spawned a series of rebuttals by investigators who study the psychology of a religion. This is a huge growth industry. Atrin, Barrett, Baring, Bloom, Boyer, Wilson, and other major books on this issue just in the past few years. These critics of the Dawkins-Blackmore argument differ among themselves. Some believe that religion is an evolved adaptation. Others think it is a byproduct of a series of cognitive modules that evolve for other purposes, agent detection, theory of mind, etc. All of them see the ubiquitous presence of religious belief as grounded in biology. Regardless of whether the theorist takes an adaptationist or a byproduct stance toward religion, they oppose the Dawkins-Blackmore position that religion is a meme virus, a copy-me instruction that not only is not functional for the human host but may actually be deleterious. I would argue in contrast, that all of these theorists, Dawkins and Blackmore, as well as their critics, are focused at the wrong grain size. The debate should not be about whether religion itself is a mean, but about the specific content that tends to go into the slots created by the confluence of cognitive modules that support religion, according to some theorists. As one commentator on these debates stated it, the bottom line, according to byproduct theorists, is that children are born with a tendency to believe in omniscience, invisible minds, immaterial souls, and then they grow up in cultures that fill their minds, hardwired for belief, with specifics, unquote. The model here is analogous to those of language. Memetics can accept much of this model without dispute. The fundamental memetic insight is simply that the specifics matter. It matters whether the content going into the hardwired slots serve the host's interests, or indeed, for indeed it is well accepted that vehicle interests can diverge from replicator interests. In the case of religion, it matters whether the specifics are blowing yourself up in order to send a message by slaughtering infidels, or whether the specifics are ministering to the poor in Calcutta. The specifics that go into the slots can be more or less rational for the individual, as emphasized in the research on human rationality in cognitive science that I shall mention shortly. Scott Atran, for example, provides an example of the grain size error in making the argument that cultural knowledge is constrained. He describes a study of people interpreting a cartoon with a group of fish together and a single outlier fish on the outside of the group. Chinese participants interpret the lone fish as an outcast, whereas Americans interpret the lone fish as more daring and intelligent. Atran acknowledges that it seems, quote, that such robust and systematic cultural differences actually reinforce the memeticist's claim, unquote. However, Atran aligns himself with the evolutionary psychologist emphasis on evoked rather than transmitted culture, and chooses to emphasize the cultural constraints in the situation rather than the variability. He calls on us to notice, quote, members of neither cultural group interpret the animated fish cartoon simply as changing patterns of illumination, as a lifeless screen, as a moving cluster and a point, as a temporal sequence of clusters and a point, and then he gives a very long list, or any of an infinitely many other logically possible interpretations of the scene observed, unquote. Now, I would argue that these are constraints, surely, but they are so loose that they demarcate only a belief structure of a large grain size. More to the point is to ask whether these constraints limit the belief structures demarcated to only fitness-increasing or vehicle-enhancing beliefs. If not, then these biological constraints are at a large enough grain size that they leave untouched the fundamental memetic insight, that a belief may spread without necessarily being true or helping the human being who holds the belief in any way. Cosmides and Tooby, in an essay published in an economics journal in order to introduce economists to evolutionary psychology, provide a classic example of the grain size problem. In a series of points laid out like a series of axioms, they argue that because, quote, natural selection built the decision-making machinery in human minds, and because this set of cognitive devices generates all economic behavior, therefore the design features of these devices define and constitute the human universal principles that guide economic decision-making, unquote. These postulates lead Cosmides and Tooby to the grandiose claim that, quote, evolutionary psychology should be able to supply a list of human universal preferences and of the procedures by which additional preferences are acquired or reordered, unquote. But to the extent that the claim is true, it is true only because the grain size of the predictions will be all wrong. The economics literature is not full of studies debating whether humans who are dying of thirst prefer water or shelter, or whether men prefer 23-year-old females over 75-year-old ones for mates. Instead, the literature is full of studies trying to determine the rationale for such fine-grained judgments as, for example, from the economics literature, whether a poorly designed briefcase produced by an athletic shoe company will adversely affect the family brand name. Economists and psychologists are not debating the reasons for preferences among basic biological needs. Instead, they are debating the reasons for fine-grained preferences among highly symbolic products. Even after we grant evolutionary assumptions like, for example, that people use clothes purchases for some type of modern dominance display or sexual display, we have not progressed very far in explaining how brand names wax and wane in the fashion world, or how price elastic such purchases will be, and or what kind of substitutability there will be among these types of goods, all standard economic predictions. The predictions that we can make from the postulates of evolutionary theory are at too gross a level to be useful. As is the case with religion, all of the action is at the lower level of content specifics, precisely the area where memetic insights might be most useful. Even a theorist as nuanced as Unger, whose work I greatly admire, makes a version of the grain size error. Here he argues that good indirect evidence for memes would consist of establishing that there is an independent dynamic to cultural change which cannot be assigned to the goal-directed activity of people. This is why memes are commonly invoked to explain maladaptive cultural traits, why advocates often gravitate toward examples of memes which seem irrational for individuals. The problem is that, except for the odd trait here and there, culture is overwhelmingly adaptive for people, allowing our species to dominate our home planet in fairly spectacular fashion. Yes, it is true that culture has allowed our species to dominate our home planet in a fairly spectacular fashion, but it is not the adaptiveness or self-replicating nature of culture per se that we are debating. It is the specific cultural contents and whether they have self-replicating properties that are independent of human goals. Unger implicitly acknowledges this with his odd trait here and there comment, although as you will see, I disagree with his quantitative assessment. Nevertheless, Unger brings in an issue that is highly relevant to the debate over memes: human irrationality. The debate over memes has indeed been contentious. There is in fact much hostility directed toward the meme concept. Certainly some of the professional hostility stems from territorial encroachment. Memetic theorists have come in with a new language and colonized areas previously occupied by disciplines that had claimed the study of cultural evolution for themselves, such as anthropology and sociology. Unger's quote here, in alluding to issues of rationality, reveals another source of hostility. Controversies over how to conceive human rationality and over the existence of human irrationality have loomed large in many academic disciplines not restricted to economics, philosophy, psychology, and legal studies. Many important theories in these disciplines are committed to understanding human beings from the standpoint of assumptions of optimality, rationality, and functionality. These theories have benefited from the default values built into folk language. Take, for example, one that I mentioned earlier, the term belief. Both in folk language and in many areas of psychology suggests something reflectively chosen, or at least something that is characterized by an active commitment by the person's true self. The very term belief directs attention away from the memetic insight, that you may be holding beliefs that are not true and that are not serving your goals in any way. The term meme, of course, highlights the possibility of the memetic insight. It puts beliefs on a level playing field. In my use of the term, not Sperber's, as I discussed previously, the term is neutral. It allows that many beliefs may be functional for the individual, but it does not obscure the possibility of non-functional beliefs. Instead, it suggests the possibility of non-functional beliefs to people who may not have thought of that possibility before, because the folk language of belief obscures it. This is why I am a fan, as a psychologist, of the meme term. The concept of the meme allows us to get a handle on, to examine at a distance, the cultural artifacts that infect our thoughts. This distancing function is greatly aided by the language of memetic science. If only in its vocabulary it provides additional mind tools to aid in the difficult, because deeply recursive, project of cognitive self-examination. One way that the meme concept will aid cognitive self-analysis is that by emphasizing the epidemiology of belief, it will indirectly suggest to many, for whom it will be a new insight, the contingency of belief. The concept of the meme is cognitively liberating because it aids in the task of mental self-examination by making it easier to achieve cognitive distancing. Memes desanctify beliefs. memes are solvents for beliefs, and they are epistemic equalizers in the following sense. By providing a common term for all cultural units, memetic science deconstructs the unreflective privileging of certain memes that have leaked into culture through arbitrary historical accident and through specific meme strategies that encourage privileging. The very concept of the meme will suggest to more and more people who become aware of it that they need to engage in some meme therapy to ponder whether they have thoughtfully taken on a meme or have simply been infected by it without any critical input from their analytic intelligence. We are evolutionarily contingent animals, as Stephen Jay Gould emphasizes. Evolution did not have to result in humans. Likewise, our memetic evolution is highly contingent, both at the level of culture as a whole and at the level of the individual. A full awareness of the latter on the part of humans would have a distancing effect, would lead to less self-identification with non-reflectively acquired memes. Probably a good thing for overall vehicle well-being. Some people might have difficulty, however, with the notion that the beliefs they hold are contingent products of memetic evolution. One demonstration of how unnatural this idea will be for some people is provided by the response to one questionnaire subscale developed in my own lab. This subscale is designed to assess individual differences in people's ability to appreciate the historical contingency of important memeplexes that they have acquired. One item on this scale is the following statement, to which the subject must agree or disagree, strongly, moderately, or mildly. Even if my environment, family, neighborhood, schools had been different, I probably would have had the same religious views. Religion, of course, is the classic case of environmentally contingent memes. The extreme environmental contingency of religious beliefs, along with their usual conjoining with evaluation disabling faith-based strategies, are the things that most strongly suggest these types of beliefs are not reflectively acquired. Nevertheless, in several studies, my colleagues and I have repeatedly found that roughly 40 to 55% of a university student population will deny that their religious views are conditioned in any way by their historical circumstances, parents, country, education. Roughly similar percentages deny the historical contingent nature of other types of beliefs measured on this scale. This is work done in conjunction with Maggie and with Richard West in Virginia in the U.S. In short, in many cases, the student from suburban Virginia feels that she would have Baptist Christian beliefs even if he or she grew up in New Delhi, because this is what God ordained for them. That this is patently absurd suggests that the realization of the epidemiological nature of beliefs, a realization fostered by the meme concept, is going to have conceptual consequences for a substantial portion of the population. And inchoate recognition of this implication probably in part accounts for the hostility toward the meme concept discussed previously. Memetic science threatens to level the epistemic playing field and thus engenders hostility. In the book that Jinsus reviewed, I argued that when combined with the tools of decision science, the concept of the meme can help humans more efficiently achieve their goals. A brain aware of the replicator vehicle distinction and in the possession of evaluative memeplexes such as science, logic, and decision theory might begin a process of pruning vehicle thwarting goals from intentional level psychology. This is exactly what the canons of instrumental rationality were designed to accomplish. Evolutionary psychologists are prone to create obstacles to this program of cognitive reform because they resist this extrapolation, falling back on their culture on a leash notion. What evolutionary psychologists do not like is the idea of memes becoming completely unglued from genetic control, and this is precisely the notion that most memetic theorists are advancing. Tooby and Kosmides wish to diminish the importance of what they term epidemiological culture and emphasize the importance of so-called evoked culture in its assumption that our developmental and psychological programs evolved to invite the social and cultural worlds in, but only the parts that tended, on balance, to have adaptively useful effects, unquote. It is for this reason that evolutionary psychologists are hostile to the concept of the meme. Science writer Robert Wright paraphrases the Tooby and Cosmides position as essentially saying that ideas must, quote, have a kind of harmony with the brains they settle into, unquote. However, unlike Tooby and Cosmides, Wright realizes that there are implications that follow from being aware of this fact in the context of the replicator-vehicle distinction. So, after noting that ideas must have a kind of harmony with the brains they settle into, Wright warns that, quote, that doesn't mean they're good for those brains in the long run, unquote. A brain that realizes this startling and still underappreciated fact might begin the admittedly difficult process of slipping culture off the leash of the genes when the culture is dysfunctional for the person. Modern cognitive science reminds us that differing optimization criteria apply to the personal and subpersonal level of analysis, utility maximization versus genetic fitness. And this could have equally profound cultural implications. Here is the link to the cognitive science work in human rationality I mentioned earlier. Evolutionary psychologists implicitly undervalue instrumental rationality when they attempt to defend as adaptively appropriate non-normative responses made by many subjects in reasoning experiments. There can be conflicts between two different types of optimization, utility maximization at the personal level and fitness maximization at the subpersonal level. Evolutionarily adaptive behavior is not the same as rational behavior. Evolutionary psychologists sometimes obscure this by implying that if a behavior is adaptive, it is rational. Such a conflation represents a fundamental error of much import for human affairs. Definitions of rationality must be kept consistent with the entity whose optimization is at issue. This conflation, the conflation of genetic fitness with vehicle-level rationality, is at the heart of the dispute between researchers working in the heuristics and biases tradition in psychology and their critics in the evolutionary psychology camp, disputes in which my research group have been involved both empirically and theoretically. Unger is thus right to raise the rationality issue, but he mischaracterizes the state of evidence in the cognitive science of human rationality. Research in what has been termed the heuristics and biases tradition has firmly established that people's responses often deviate from the performance considered normative on many reasoning tasks. For example, people assess probabilities incorrectly, they display confirmation bias, they test hypotheses inefficiently, they violate the axioms of utility theory, they do not properly calibrate degrees of belief, they display logical framing effects, they show outcome bias and hindsight bias, they uneconomically honor sunk cost, they allow prior knowledge to become implicated in deductive reasoning, and they display numerous other processing biases too numerous to mention. These effects studied in the heuristics and biases literature are a comprehensive selection of the axioms of expected utility theory. They amount to a thorough test of the axiomatic strictures of instrumental rationality. Thus, Cosmides and Tooby might be right that we tend to acquire content that fits well with our evolved psychological capacities, but what these findings mean is that that content that best fits these evolved psychological capacities might well make us fail to achieve instrumental rationality. We could do better by using some of the free-floating cultural software that evolutionary psychologists tend to de-emphasize. For example, research in the heuristics and biases tradition suggests that most of the probabilistic concepts that fit our evolved reasoning modules well are in fact wrong. People commit the gambler's fallacy, they display conjunction errors, they fail to show regressiveness in their predictions, etc. Instrumental rationality diverges from evolutionary adaptation, and we will need reasoning tools that are cultural inventions not well fit to evolutionarily adapted modules in order to maximize human fulfillment. Evolutionary psychologists, and to a lesser extent the gene-culture coevolution theorists, have not liked the idea of culture off the genetic leash, but the empirical work in decision science indicates that we need to emphasize just that in order to maximize human goal fulfillment. Correct probabilistic concepts are not naturally evoked by our pre-existing modular adaptations, they need to be taught. Finally, as a side comment, I would note that although it is common in the literature to assert that there has been little empirical work on memes, this work on heuristics and biases indirectly tests the critical proposition that people can acquire cultural software that is dysfunctional. Many of the probability concepts that people naturally acquire are just that, dysfunctional in that they are less than fully rational in an instrumental sense. Humans are the first organisms capable of recognizing that there may be goals embedded in their brains that serve the interest of their genes during the environment of evolutionary adaptation, and that oppose their own current interests, and the first organisms capable of choosing not to pursue those goals. They are the creatures with the most complex goal structure and the one with the structure with some unique implications. As shown in this slide, all creatures on Earth have goals characterized by areas A and B in this figure. The area labeled A indicates the majority of cases where the replicator and vehicle goals coincide. For a bee, not flying into a brick wall serves both the interest of the replicators and of the bee itself as a coherent organism. Gene-centered universal Darwinism makes the important point, though, that there exists a non-zero area B. A set of goals that serve only the interest of the replicators and that are antithetical to the interest of the vehicle itself. Many animals are constructed so that they will sacrifice themselves in order to propagate their genes, a fact revealed in studies in many phenomena in evolutionary biology showing that vehicle and replicator interests do not always coincide. For example, in the study of senescence, heterozygous advantage, sexual selection, kin selection, segregation disorders, sexual reproduction itself, and the existence of junk DNA. Natural selection acts not to optimize things from the point of view of the vehicle. Humans are the only animals who have come along who could recognize that this is happening and seek to minimize it. Likewise, humans are the only creatures on Earth with an area C in the figure. Humans with flexible intelligence and long-leash goals can develop goals that are completely dissociated from genetic optimization, goals that serve the vehicle's interests but not those of the genes. We need not go beyond the obvious example of sex with contraception, an act which serves the vehicle's goal without serving the gene's goal of reproduction. A flexible brain is busy coordinating multiple long-term goals, including its own survival and pleasure goals, and these multiple long-term goals can come to overshadow its reproductive goal. From the standpoint of the genes, the human brain can sometimes be like a Mars explorer run amok. It is so busy coordinating its secondary goals, master your environment, engage in social relations with other agents, etc., that it sometimes ignores the primary goal of replicating the genes that the secondary ones were supposed to serve. Memes enter into this figure in two ways. First, once goals of type C enter the picture, it pays for the organism to acquire memes that foster personal optimization rather than genetic fitness. Many of these memes will be represented by the cultural software that fosters instrumental rationality, probabilistic thinking, causal reasoning, the strictures of decision theory, etc. Because rationality is a vehicle-level construct as opposed to fitness, which is a subpersonal construct. The second way in which memetics enters is when we add a necessary complication to this figure. The possibility of humans having goals that serve neither their personal interests nor their genetic interests. This would seem to be an odd state of affairs, but there are actually two ways in which it can happen. One, totally acceptable to evolutionary psychologists. That is, the environment might have changed from the EEA, rendering a previous adaptation non-functional. This is what Richardson and Boyd term the big mistake in evolutionary terms. The second, of course, is what I have been discussing in this talk, the possibility of a true mean virus from category 4 in my earlier taxonomy, one that does not have the additional benefit of serving vehicle goals, that is, a true parasite. So I leave you with the view of memes that acknowledges Dawkins' warnings about viruses of the mind, but one that also stresses that memes can embody cultural learning that advances human fulfillment because memes, at a sufficiently small grain size, can escape the genetic leash. Memes can enhance human rationality without enhancing genetic fitness because these two types of optimization can dissociate. That there are two sides to memes reinforces Dawkins' point that it is imperative that they be reflectively acquired.